Hola, ¿qué onda? ¿Cómo estás? Bienvenido o bienvenida a este video. Hello and welcome to today's video. So, you want to learn how to speak perfect Mexican Spanish? Well, you are in the right place. My name is Nate. I've been learning Spanish for more than 11 years. I've been teaching for more than 6. I currently live in Mexico, and oftentimes native Spanish speakers will confuse me to be Mexican. That is not a joke. I have videos of it. You can see. So people really do think that I am Mexican when I speak Spanish. And I'm going to teach you how to do just the same thing. Let's take a look. First off, ¿qué onda? This just means what's up. Literally, onda is a wave. So for example, the word microondas, this literally is a microwave, okay? A wave, like in the ocean, would be an ola, okay? Una ola grande, for example, a big wave. But we use onda to just say, what's up? ¿Qué onda? ¿Qué onda? ¿Cómo estás? What's up? How are you? This is used in informal settings. We use it with friends. I'd also like to say, this video is going to go over all the little nitty gritty things of Mexican Spanish, but I have another video here on this channel called 28 Words and Phrases to Speak Perfect Mexican Spanish that goes over all the most important words and phrases you need in order to speak a more Mexican Spanish, okay? But this kind of goes over the nitty gritty of Mexican Spanish. Okay, so next we need to focus on the vowel sounds. Now, I always tell my students, the number one thing you need to do if you want to impress native speakers with your Spanish, and if you want to speak a more Mexican Spanish, you need to get your vowels down. Now, people often say that the Mexican accent, which there's many different accents within the country, is probably the easiest to understand compared to a country like the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, for example, okay? So, the vowels in Spanish are as following. A, E, I, O, U. Okay? A, E, I, O, U. I promise you, if you just master the vowel sounds, not only will you sound more Mexican when speaking Spanish, but your accent is just going to be way better. And oftentimes students get frustrated because they'll tell me, Nate, I went to go speak with someone, but they just automatically replied to me in English. The number one reason people do that is oftentimes just because of your accent. It's not that you don't have a good level of Spanish, but it might just be that you need to improve your accent, okay? Now, next is Mexicans love to use diminutives and of course I'm forgetting the word right now, but basically making things bigger. Oh, augmentative, there you go. Okay, so for example, casita versus casota. Okay, so una casa would be a house, and a casita would be a little house. It doesn't need to literally be a little house. It can be, but Mexicans like to use this to make things cute. Okay, so como bienvenidos a mi casita, like welcome to my humble abode, welcome to my little house. It's just a way to make something sound cute. Sometimes my girlfriend will call me chiquillo or chiquito, just as a term, kind of making it sound cute. You might have heard people say mamacita before, okay? Same exact idea. Casota, on the other hand, is a big thing. Oh, ese güey tiene una casota. That guy has a really big house, casota, okay? You can also say, I like saying this, we can take the adjective grande, meaning big, and we can say grandote or grandota, for example. So, I could say, órale, su camioneta es grandota. Like it's really big, okay? So there's the diminutive and the augmentative, okay? So ita, ota, for example, or ito or oto, okay? Okay, next. Why is it that Mexicans always add le to words? Things like súbele or órale. This used to really confuse the heck out of me. Súbele would be like, hey, turn up the radio, okay? Now, technically, if we're talking about turning up the volume on the radio, there's only that one thing that's getting turned up, which in this case would be the volume. So you'd think it would be sube la, either referring to the radio or the volume. But in Mexico, it's very normal that people will say something like súbele or órale. Now, oftentimes le in Mexico is not necessarily grammatically correct, or there's no real big reason behind it. So le, as you might know, is an indirect object pronoun. So for example, le conté la historia. So I told her or I told him the story. Well, in Mexico, oftentimes we'll just add it on here to provide extra emphasis, or if we don't want something to sound as strong, for example. So súbele, so turn it up, whatever. Okay, so that could be used for emphasis. Or the phrase órale, the verb orar actually means to pray, but in the modern day, Órale just means like, wow, like, oh, right on, órale, or like you're surprised by something. Órale, okay, does the le represent anything? Not necessarily. We're just saying, oh, wow, órale, okay? So you could say súbele, órale, ándale, but you could also use it as like dile or cuéntale, for example. Okay, so you may have heard people say dijistes. This is wrong. Dijistes, for example, ¿qué dijistes? That is technically incorrect. However, many native Spanish speakers within the United States will say dijistes instead of dijiste. And there are Spanish speakers within Mexico who will also say dijistes, but technically this is incorrect. So when you're speaking, you should say dijiste instead of dijistes. Now, even though it's technically incorrect, if you said dijistes, you could argue that you might even sound more native because that's kind of a more niche thing. Okay, so dijiste versus dijistes. For example, the letters B and V in Spanish pretty much make the same sound. There is a subtle difference in certain situations, but I always teach my students that B and V make the same sound. So for example, the word vivir, okay, it's not vivir, it's vivir, okay, kind of that soft B sound. But one time I was in the state of Chiapas, which is the southernmost state in Mexico. It's actually the most poor state in all of Mexico. And I saw the word vestidores, meaning changing rooms, vestidores. And they had written the word vestidores with a B instead of a V, which is technically incorrect. But it just goes to show you that even though it's technically incorrect, any native Spanish speaker within Mexico is going to understand what that person is saying or what they meant in writing. So same idea with dijistes. I don't recommend you say it, but you can. The proper thing to say is dijiste, okay? Now, when it comes to filler words, say things like este, o sea, pues. Do not say okay? So if you want to say or you want to pause, say something like este, okay, it's a one letter difference. But if I ever hear someone say when they're speaking to me in Spanish, it is a dead giveaway that they were not born in Mexico. It's very likely that this person is from the United States. So I have many Spanish speaking friends from the US, and sometimes when they come to visit me in Mexico and we're speaking Spanish and I hear them say it's a good reminder, oh wow, I would never hear anyone, coming from Mexico City say People will say or este. Okay, it's very rare that a native Spanish speaker will say Okay, so try not to say use este or and o sea just means like in other words or rather. Pues means well, pues, well. ¿Qué te iba a decir? O sea, what I mean is, or rather, okay? Now, the word pedo in Mexico, it means about 10 million different things, okay? Pedo literally means a fart, okay? Eché un pedo, okay? I farted, okay? Pedo. However, in Mexico, pedo can mean a whole variety of things. It can mean drunk, it can mean problem. You can use it when you're upset with someone. You could say, ¿qué pedo? That could mean, what's up? Like, hey, ¿qué pedo, güey? ¿Cómo estás? Like, what's up, man? Use them on friends. But if you change the tone and you sound angry, oye, ¿qué pedo? Hey, man, like, what the hell? What's going on, man? What's up? All right, pedo. Okay, so pedo can mean, estoy pedo, I'm drunk. ¿Qué pedo? Like, that can mean, what a problem, or like, ¿qué pedo? Like, what the heck? Like, ¿qué pedo? What the heck? Okay, so pedo can mean lots of different things. All right, so we have different words in Spanish that in Mexican Spanish that kind of have different meanings, but pedo is probably the most popular one. Next, I have a little phrase here that you can use to sound more native when speaking Mexican Spanish. And I recommend you learn Mexican phrases like this. Meter la pata, literally meaning to put the paw in, for example. You kind of think of it in English as like putting your foot in your mouth is kind of probably what we would say. Meter la pata is just when you mess something up. So like, ay, amigo, metí la pata con mi novia. For example, like, oh man, I messed up with my novia. I made a mistake. Metí la pata, okay? So that's kind of a phrase you could use if you want to sound more Mexican. All right, let's check these out now. Now, in the United States, we have lots of words in Spanish coming from English. Words like troca, lonche, biles. Once again, these are technically incorrect. However, Spanish speakers within the United States will use these. So are they incorrect? Yes and no. I mean, it's just what has happened with the language. So it's not necessarily correct nor incorrect. It's just what it is, okay? However, in Mexico, here, for example, in Mexico City, if I were to hear someone say troca, lonche, biles, I would know that they're probably from the north of Mexico or they're from the United States. So troca means truck. In Mexico, it's more common that we'll hear camioneta. Okay, camioneta would be truck. And if you have a really cool truck in the US, and I believe in the north of Mexico as well, you can say mamalona. So if you kind of have like a low rider, really cool truck, you can also say ramfla, which is kind of like a low rider, but mamalona is kind of like a tricked out truck, basically. You're really getting some niche Spanish right now. Okay, so troca would be camioneta most times. Lonche, coming from lunch. Here in Mexico City, we would say la comida. So if I were to just say to you, hey, ¿qué vamos a comer? If I say ¿qué vamos a comer? That could mean one of two things. That could mean what are we going to eat, or what are we going to eat for lunch? So ¿qué vamos a comer para la comida? For example, la comida meaning lunch. You may have heard the word almuerzo. Yes, you can use it here in Mexico. You might hear that more in Spain or other Latin American countries. But in Mexico, we can just say la comida, the food or lunch. And finally, biles. That's coming from the word bills in English. But in Spanish, it's better to say las cuentas. Okay, tengo que pagar mis cuentas. I have to pay my bills instead of saying tengo que pagar mis biles. Okay? Now, just an interesting fun fact for you. The word aguacate, or avocado in English, the word aguacate in Spanish actually comes from the Nahuatl word meaning avocado. And actually, aguacatl, coming from Nahuatl, means avocado, but it also means testicle. So kind of fun fact for you. Also, the word azúcar, okay, meaning sugar, this actually comes from Arabic. Remember that the Spaniards came to Mexico, and that's why we speak Spanish in Mexico. But there's a lot of Arab influence going on in the Iberian Peninsula, throughout history. And so a lot of words that begin with AZ or AL are actually coming from Arabic. So words like almohada, alcázar, azúcar, for example. Or you may have heard the phrase ojalá. That actually comes from Arabic. So Allah, right, meaning God. Ojalá in Spanish would mean God willing, or hopefully, or I hope so. You can kind of take out a bunch of different translations into English, but those words actually come from Arabic. So it's pretty cool. A word like tlacuache, from my understanding, meaning opossum, that comes from an indigenous language here in Mexico. And actually, in Mexico, I believe there are 68 or 69 indigenous languages. So things like, Otomi, Maya, Tzotzil, Nahuatl, a bunch of them. So really, really cool. So we kind of have different words getting mixed and blended there. Also, just another fun fact, the food pozole, or the dish rather, here in Mexico, kind of like that popular soup, that's traditionally now it's made with pork meat. It's kind of like it's got hominy, which is like a big thick corn. Really nice dish, and it has pork meat. Well, originally that was actually coming from an indigenous dish in Mexico, I believe from the Aztecs. And it was essentially, they would do human sacrifices and they would make this kind of soup with the hominy, which was considered to be kind of like a sacred food. And then they would eat human meat in pozole. But then when the Spaniards came, they changed it for pork. And supposedly pork tastes the most similar to human flesh. So I don't know. I'm not a first-hand witness. I couldn't tell you that, but that's what they say. Now, when it comes to ordering in Mexico, what's the difference between me da versus me das? Okay. Well, me da is like the most formal way to say this. Me da, give me. And you might think that sounds kind of strong, Nate. Why would I say me da? Wouldn't it be better to say, me gustaría or quiero? No, actually in Mexico, this is considered to be very polite and normal. Me da. Okay, so this would be kind of like usted, da. Whereas me das, with an S on the end, would be just the informal. Both work. If you say this to someone who's older than you, no one's going to turn their heads. You say me das, blah, 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 whatever. But if you want to be more formal, say me da. These are kind of an informal way of commanding people to do things. So typically, a command here would be something like deme or dame, okay? But when you put the object pronoun before the verb, it's kind of an even more passive way to command someone to do something. So instead of saying, pásame la sal, pass me the salt, I can say, oye, ¿me pasas la sal, por favor? It's like an even more indirect way to ask someone to do something for you, okay? Now, a big mistake, I don't want to say a mistake, but something I see a lot of people do is when they're traveling in Mexico, they'll say to people, ¿cómo estás? Or ¿cómo está? This is fine, and it's not necessarily incorrect, But it's way more natural and normal to say buenos días, buenas tardes, or buenas noches. Buenos días and buenas tardes are the most common. But when I first came to Mexico, I would say that to people like, hola, ¿cómo estás? Or ¿cómo está? That's fine. Totally works. But it's better to say, hola, buenas tardes, or buenas tardes, whatever. That's totally fine. And then you proceed to say whatever it is you want to say, okay? Now, my personal advice for learning Mexican Spanish and you know how I've been able to get to the level that I'm at now, to where people genuinely think I'm a Mexican Spanish speaker, is number one is to speak con Mexicanos. Speak with Mexican Spanish speakers. The number one mistake I think I made when I first started learning Spanish is that I wasn't speaking enough. And you might be in a similar situation. You might be too nervous to speak to people. You might not have anyone to speak Spanish with. But that's a big mistake. I'll talk about this in a little bit. In my free Spanish community, you can speak with people and myself to practice. But speaking is the number one thing you need to do if you really want to improve your Spanish faster and if you really want to learn that Mexican Spanish, okay? Next is to listen to Mexican audio. Remember that throughout Mexico, there are different accents and words that are used. So like I said, in the north of Mexico, it might be totally normal for someone in Monterrey to say the word troca or lonche. Truthfully, I don't know, but that is kind of because there's more of that influence from the United States, more influence from English. However, if you're in Oaxaca or Chiapas, if you were to use the word biles or lonche or troca, people might look at you a little weird. Now, there are different words used in Mexico City than there are in Oaxaca and Hidalgo and Chiapas and so on and so forth. You know, and there's also different little cultural differences. Things like in Mexico City, a lot of people from Mexico City get bullied by everyone else in Mexico because quesadillas in Mexico City do not have cheese in them. You might be thinking, well, what the heck? The cheese is in the word quesadillas. But in Mexico City, when you order a quesadilla on the street, if you say, me da una quesadilla con hongos, por favor, you are just going to get a tortilla with mushrooms, and that's it. You have to say, me da una quesadilla con queso y hongos, por favor. Okay? So, anyways, kind of a funny thing there, okay? But listen to Mexican audio. So if you want to learn a more northern Mexican Spanish, then listen to audio from the north. That could be music, you know, groups like Los Tigres del Norte, Intocable, Los Tucanes de Tijuana, those kinds of groups. Or you could listen to, you know, people coming from maybe the middle of the country or whatever, or just listen to audio in Mexican Spanish. But I will say your environment definitely will shape your accent. When I first came to Mexico City, my girlfriend who's from here would tell me, Nathan, you speak like you're from the north of Mexico. Like you have this kind of, ¿qué onda? ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo has estado? I was speaking kind of with more like a acento cantadito. Kind of like a more sing-song accent, okay? Kind of typical of the north, okay? So speak, listen, and study. I have a Mexican Spanish Pro course. You can check it out. Join the free community, and then if you want to upgrade to my full academy, you can get access to my Mexican Spanish Pro course. But this goes through everything in detail. I think you've probably noticed by now, I absolutely love Mexican Spanish, and it's kind of my favorite thing to focus on because it's fun. It's the Spanish I've learned. Okay, so study Mexican Spanish. Okay, learn the words and phrases. You know, learn what to say, what not to say, and also learn about the different, you know, cultural things. Learn about funny superstitions or, you know, things to do and not to do when you go to order at a food stand, for example. Okay, but that's basically it. That is my advice. If you feel like I missed something, please leave me a comment on this video letting me know. If you need help or have questions, just leave a comment on this video or send me an email at support@SpanishNate.com. And like I said, if you want to join my free online Spanish community, check it out. We have more than 400 members at the time of this recording. Check it out, totally free, really fun. You can literally direct message me one-on-one. It's very valuable. And anyways, muchas gracias por ver este video y espero que tengas muy buen día. Hasta luego.